soybeans and corn, so it's pretty not bad.
Right
yeah. So,
right on.
But anyway, guys, we'll get rolling because it's 10 o'clock. Welcome everyone. I see there's about 40 people coming online here, and we'll probably have more trickle in as we go. We'll have a recording for you guys, but really what we wanted to talk to you today on is building bigger soybeans and how to raise a profitable crop in 2020, right? There's a lot going on in the world right now. And sometimes a lot of things grab our focus and attention, but if we can give a little bit of attention to detail to some things at planting here, and certainly into the early part of the season, can really pay dividends come harvest time, even despite everything that's going on. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We got a really good agenda lined up. Adam's going to talk first a little bit about where soybean physiology and management intersect, and we'll have a good conversation about that. And then Scott will cover off some Ontario focused data that Pioneer's collected over the years, and just some things to think about as you're out planting or as you prepare to plant. So that's what we're here to talk about. But first, I'm going to go through a quick tutorial on how to use the chat function, how to use the webinar functionality that we have here. Much of you would probably use Zoom at this point, I'm going to assume, be it for a family function or for business even. We've been doing quite a bit of that. But I just wanted to draw your attention, if you're joining by audio, when you join, I have it so that you are muted. But and we'll probably keep it that way, just to keep the sound lines clear, and so we can hear Adam and Scott and myself as much as you want to hear me talk. But you can certainly use your phone to listen in, and just if you go here and you switch to phone audio, that's usually the best way to listen if your internet's a little choppy. So you can do that. You click that, it'll give you a number to dial in on. Or you can get it to call me. So you just dial one of these numbers. They're all toll free, or this toll free number here, probably the best one. But you can also get it to just call you straight up. So this is my cell phone number. If you do have a question or anything, just feel free to text me throughout. I'm the host, so I'll do that. No problem there. And then I wanted to draw your attention to this chat function here. So you'll see down at the bottom, this is how we'll be handling questions. If you have any questions for Adam or Scott or myself, you can certainly use the chat function. And we'll do a few questions here just going into the webinar. And I have a couple laid out, but if you have any questions for either Scott or Adam at any time, just use that chat function. It should open this box up, and you can write a message or put your input in however you feel. So if you're on a phone, it's the same kind of thing. Just click down to this more button, and you can hit chat. So with that, we'll roll. I'll just test this out for a second here and see if it's working. So I have a chat question for you, and feel free to answer as you please. But I just wanted to ask you guys how planting has progressed on your farm so far in 2020. So we have, when I sent this invite out, I sent it to all of Ontario and Quebec, so we should have a good wide representation if people are on. 50 people, so people can draw too, right? So there you go. But feel free to add this into the chat as you feel fit to. So I see, 10% corn, 80% beans from Adam. I'd say we're probably 5%. 20% corn. We could be by the end of the week. Lots of answers rolling in. Good. So we are starting to go, right? Yeah. There's alfalfa there from Napkin Special. And yeah, certainly not a lot of people have to be planting, right? You're not in a hurry yet. Maybe your soil conditions aren't fit. Maybe you're on a bit of a heavier ground, or the situation's different for you, and that's okay. We got to think we're in April here, and it is Canada, but important to keep in mind that things are happening right now, and look into why they are happening. So, next question. if I will advance here. I should be able to clear those annotations, right? Yeah, there we go. What do you look for when deciding to plant soybeans? So A, I wait until the ground will carry, or B, I hold until the ground will carry and my conditions are suitably fit. C, I wait until the ground will carry, my soil conditions are suitably fit, and the temperature average is 10 degrees in soil there, realized throughout the day. Or D, it says store in a cold, dark place somewhere on that bag of beans, right? Okay. Right on, good. Lots of different answers here. Good
Adam likes answer B. Ooh, can't wait to hear more.
Right on. So that's good. We know how to use this. I'll be using it a little bit more throughout the presentation, but just wanted to give you guys a bit of an update on what's happening in Eastern Ontario, specifically where I am. So conditions compared to 2019 are far and away better than they were when we thought about planting at all. You know, we've really given some. I was out soil testing the other day, and you can see on the left-hand picture just some of the conditions I was running into, and I never even dreamt of seeing that in April last year. So it's pretty incredible to see how mellow the soils are and how fit they are going forward. But that being said, I think this is one of the more important things to think about when we do get planting, is go and take a look at your soils, how they change over your field, go in certain areas and have a look. Just get a garden claw or a shovel and do some digging, right? And see how things change throughout that soil profile, and do a ribbon test, because even this year you might find that, you know, there's some balances. A lot of people saying soils are beautifully fit, but you really have to pay attention to your soil, and that involves getting out and going and have a look, and really just looking to see if that soil is crumbling. When you do that ribbon test, make a mass or structure in your hand, get a feel for the soil texture and fitness that way. But I've been getting a lot of questions about this, that store in the cold, dark place comment I put in before. Actually, it was a buddy of mine who said that about his corn. It says that right on the bag, doesn't it? So I wanted to explore that a little bit further, so I buried some data loggers. These things you can see here in my hand, they're called Watchdog, and they just say take a soil temperature every 30 minutes. I set them to, or you can set them to hourly, but you bury them in the soil. And this has been since April 8th through that week here. I dig them up every Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning, and you can see how soil temperatures have changed at 2-inch depth on this North Core loam. Pretty reflective of the area I am situated in, just outside of Ottawa here. But you can see we're not really trending upwards here in the first couple early weeks. When things really started picking up here was the 25th and 26th, when I really started seeing things get moving. So this 25th here, we had really good increase in soil temperature here. This is at 1-inch depth though. So when I did those other two, it was at 2 inches. And now these I did at 1-inch depth, 2-inch depth, and 3-inch depth. So you can see here at the 1-inch depth, quite a bit of fluctuation here. Larger peaks and the valleys, distance to peaks and valleys, and a pretty low temperature at night, right? And you can see that this is right around 9 o'clock where this would happen, and we'd get drops, right? But just following that has been interesting, and really begs the question, what soil temperatures are we looking for, right? At 3 inches, you can see it's consistently a little bit higher and seems to buffer a little more heat well, right? But and peaking pretty good. So that was an interesting thing. I just dug these up this morning to take a look at the last couple of weeks. So that's what's happening in the field right now. On Saturday, I was able to plant some soybeans. It was about 14 degrees by 3 p.m. when we planted. At 10, it was 9 degrees in the soil. And just on that, I'll send this out afterwards, but it's a quick crop focus on the effects of cold temperatures following soybean planting. When we were planning this call, Adam, Gaspar, and Ryan Van Rokel, an agronomist towards Iowa there that I talked to a little bit here, he mentioned that they had planted and got some cold temperatures following that. So this was really timely for them. But I'll send this out for your information just on the effect that this can have, right? And we'll get into that a little bit more. But that's a picture of us going. One more thing that I did here too is, and I'll show you guys this later, this is April 25th planting date on the side here. You can see him go and finish the rest of the field, but we left the strip here just to watch. We'll come back in May. I'd love to hear from you guys when I should come back in and plant it. But we're just going to come in here and plant some beans. And I got 2 time-lapse cameras set to take pictures every 30 minutes there. So I'll share that out as we get going. But without further ado, that's just a quick introduction. I wanted to introduce Adam Gaspar. He's a Corteva integrated field scientist for North America, and I think globally now too for the seed treatment side of things. And we've had Adam up to speak a number of times before I was actually in the role I am now, and have heard great things. So I'll let Adam give a little bit of a preamble, and we'll just do a quick test to make sure Adam's stuff is working. So go ahead and take over, Adam, if you like.
Yep, you bet. No, thanks. Thanks, Chris. Let's get my screen shared here. See about that. And let's hit the slideshow here. And there we are. Does that look good on your end, Chris?
Yep, I can see that.
Wonderful. Well, hey, glad to be with the team again. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, I spent some time in person with all of you in Ontario, and really enjoyed up there. A lot of similar challenges from what I derived that all of you face, similar to kind of back home in eastern South Dakota. You know that we chase and try to tackle, and so I really broadly name this talk kind of the intersection of soybean physiology and management, and that allows me to keep it pretty broad-based and open and talk about various different things, and that's why I'd encourage, please use the chat function. Let me answer the questions that are on the top of your minds. I think that's the most valuable. I've got a lot prepared, but I want to make sure and address what the group is thinking or concerned with. I always think it's nice. You can see me in Zoom here, but yeah, as Chris said, based in North America, trying to move right now, which moving to Johnston is a challenge right now in the current COVID-19 situation we're in. But yeah, I'll put this up, a little background, right? SDSU alum, South Dakota State. We farm in eastern South Dakota. And one of my areas, specifically in Corteva that I spend a lot of time with and working with folks is specifically soybean research. And that's where a lot of my training is, and in an area I'm really passionate about. And hopefully that certainly comes through in this presentation and discussion. So a quick overview for everybody. And again, I'd say please chime in, as we're talking. Don't feel like you need to hold them till the end. I'll certainly do my best to answer the questions as we go, and I'm sure, Chris, if you see one, just pop in and ask it. But so we'll go over some yield trends here. Management to exploit physiology, soybean variable rate seeding, fertility musts, and then some things we can do here at planting that I think are really critical. And I think in general we've probably taken soybean management at planting for granted, and there's especially with markets where they're at and not only lower but just a lot of uncertainty right now in the grain markets. There's a lot of things we can do at planting that are virtually free to increase yield, and so I think more than ever, at times like this, we really got to focus on those those key items at planting, and how do we best exploit them. So I start off with, and I apologize, this is a graph of USDA US, soybean trend line, but they really match very well with Canada as well, especially in the soybean growing regions of Canada. And I would say in many instances are actually Canada trend lines are higher than US in some regions actually. So I look at this line here, and it's very easy that you can draw a linear line through this. And I think over time, right, it's been this nice steady, you get 0.4 of a bushel per year, and that's a combination, right, of genetics, better management, environmental factors. And then we've, kind of went back 14, 15, 16, 17. I don't have 18 or 19 on there, but those were, phenomenal soybean yielding years as well in general. And if you just draw that red line, you follow the trend of 0.4 bushels, you see we're pretty well under that. And if I'll point something out here, you see that in the equation, maybe my mouse works. Yeah, here we go. There's this R squared, right? 0.836, right? That's how well does this line represent all these various data points? And so if you draw a straight line, it's just 0.836. But if you draw a curved line like this, it actually, you get a little bit better fit of the line, and an exponential line better describes soybean yield trends. And if you were to add 18 and 19 onto this, it would fall right in line. And so I always try and remind growers that, I think the past decade has pretty clearly been the decade of soybeans. And that's been, grower focus on the crop, a lot of R&D expenditures in the crop. Us internally as a company, right, with our A-series soybeans has been a major investment that has paid off with some truly great genetic gain, which then when you couple with good management by our, by all of you, by farmers across, North America, that's when you get this exponential growth. And I think that's going to continue. And so I'll say the past decade's been the decade of soybeans, and I think we're really set up to continue that. And I think there's going to be even greater emphasis on management as we move into, climates that are just tend to be a little more variable, right? More frequent rains, bigger rains, longer dry spells. So management's going to be a key factor, as we encounter a little bit more variability in our weather and our climate, and ultimately in the environment. So I'll start, off, and I preach this every time, and I think it's been pretty well, perceived by the soybean community and by growers everywhere that, more canopy, the earlier the better, period. And it's especially in the north, and I really call the north, Iowa, in the U.S. north into Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Ontario, even further into Canada. So I just really simply, here's a very clear graph, right? SIPR is more or less just how much total sunlight you can capture by the plant, and then yield. And it's a straight line. And in some years, the line's a little bit steeper. Some years it's not as steep, but it's always positive. And there's always a benefit from capturing more sunlight. Very clearly, that's the case. The reason you see all these dots, and you could say, boy, well, 60 bushels to 20 bushels, here, if I capture 600 megajoules per meter squared, or, sun, what a big range. And these dots are over multiple years. And so what you'll find is that based on the year, the line may only be at this level. Well, that's associated with all these dots, or it may be at this yield level, or like that, or a little bit flatter. And so I think what I want to remind people is that the overall environment dictates, if you're at a 60 bushel, 40 bushel, 80 bushel, but no matter what yield level you're at, you're always increasing yield with more sunlight capture. The second one certainly would be maximizing the duration and reproductive growth phases. That again, if there's two things that you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about a soybean management practice or an equipment purchase, etc., you gotta capture more light and you gotta extend reproductive growth. Plain and simple, if you can do those two things, you're going to be increasing yield. Let's see. So I list a couple really key factors right away that virtually cost you $0, right? Planting date, row spacing, variety selection, seeding rate, some very basic ones. Clear those all drawings. There we go. And so I just give a good graphical representation. We know this, right? Everybody on the call is probably more concerned with this 40-degree latitude line here, but here's a calendar date and then total day length that we see obviously with the summer solstice landing right here. Now in the north, we don't have this long growing season, right? So it's so much more critical that around this period, we are capturing as much light as possible. So I'll say that where all of the growers are at in Canada, every day is that much more critical than someone, in the southern U.S. At a higher latitude, lower latitude. I said that wrong. Everybody here is at 55 degrees latitude. This would be more southern U.S. And so that's shown here, right? We get longer days during the solstice, got to take advantage of them. And as we looked at, that went fast, as a planting date response, this pretty well clearly illustrates it, right? So if we can get a May 1st planting date on soybeans, here's when we're going to flower, right here. And here's when we're going to basically be done with reproductive growth, about right here. And so if we compare that with the June planting date, what ends up happening, right? We shift our reproductive growth, again, R1 and R5. We shift it later in the season, less sunlight captured, and a lower duration. So a cheap deal, planting date response, very clear that increases yield. And I don't know if anybody saw my response to Chris's initial question of, what percent are you done planting on your farm? And, maybe folks noticed that I said we're 10% on corn, but 80% on soybeans. And while that goes against, past practices, where market prices are at and the yield responses to planting date that we see from an economic return, you are much better off getting your soybeans in the ground before your corn. And I know that's a tough one to switch on, but it's just so critical, especially with how corn has changed over the last 30 years, where it really can at the end of the season flex with kernel fill. I think we saw that across the U.S. last year with a lot of late planted corn that really yielded well. And again, that's, if we were to take data over the last 15 years, it would be pretty evident, that soybeans have a much steeper response to planting date than what corn does. And so anybody that says, boy, I never see that planting date response in soybeans, I would probably challenge you on what maturity group you're using. And so here's, relative yield on the Y and day of year here on the x-axis, and I put some dates up here. And when we're using a 1.5 maturity group, right, you basically do not see a planting date response for the whole month of May, right? You're within 95% of max yield within this black box. However, and I would note, that on May 1st, planting that early bean, you're really under 90% of max yield, about 86% of what max yield is, compared to planting a 2.5 bean, which is has the 100% there, but on average 98% of max yield. And you really only have about 10 days before you fall below 95% of max yield, and you see just how much steeper this planting date curve is. So I challenge you for literally free, plant your beans earlier and try a little bit longer maturity groups than what you're comfortable with. Now in the variety selection piece, maturity group should not be number one in why you're choosing any particular variety. When you're working with your rep, there's multiple factors, right? Just yield data. What's the yield performance? What's the disease package, agronomic package? But I would keep maturity group in there and make sure that you have a big enough spread in maturity group across your farm. Because many times what I see is, maybe a guy will have a 2.0, then he'll have his long stuff will be at 2.4, right? Really a 4-day difference in maturity. And we need to get a lot longer than that. And I would just encourage people, push yourself a little bit, get outside the comfort zone. And this is a, earlier planting with a longer maturity group, again, a free way to increase soybean yield and ultimately return per acre.
Adam, if I could, I'll go first. This is awesome, spot on, great information. But when you stretch the maturity group, how does that affect physiological maturity at harvest? Do you see that it delays things? Oftentimes we get pushback from customers that are anxious to get wheat planted in their crop rotation.
Yeah, I would ultimately, Scott, great call out for the folks that are, following with winter wheat. There you need to certainly be managing for optimizing the system, no doubt. So certainly take that into consideration with establishing a good wheat crop. That would be number one. If there's not wheat following and it's really just a soybean, corn rotation or et cetera, I would challenge guys, and I think what you would find is they don't last as long as you think they would. And many times the biggest thing that we give up on yield that's free is combining soybeans that are 9% or 10% moisture, and we're giving up that water weight. Right. And those are free dollars that we're literally letting evaporate right out of our pocketbook. And so I would challenge you, keep a little bit later, not the whole boat of it, but put some later. And you'd be surprised at how that maturity kind of condenses a little bit. And, if you get a little bit later, what I would tell folks and why we don't always, Scott, recommend that switch to an early variety as you delay planting is that, if you say your goal is May 1st and it's going to mature on August or, October 1st, I'll call it, really for every 3 days of delayed planting, we really only delay maturity by about a day in the fall. And so the soybean plant will naturally compress itself in the fall. And it does that not only with planting date, but maturity group as well, especially when we're planting early. So, it's kind of a see it to believe it type of a deal, but once you've done it, you've seen it and experienced, you get a lot more comfortable with it, and you'll find that these longer maturity groups don't push as late as you would think. Again, because the plant will start shutting itself down once there's not a lot of heat, not a lot of sunlight. It'll go into senescence, kind of like corn does. So good question, Scott. Another one I'll talk about is VRS, and again, really a free option for growers to better manage their annual soybean seed investment for increased yield and profitability. I'd say probably the bigger thing though is, achieving consistent product performance across the field and reducing risk. And this is, I think soybean seeding rates, Scott and Chris, has just been a topic that has been discussed for decades, right? I wasn't born when this discussion started, and it'll continue. And I think for a long time, I think there's been a perception of academia and industry kind of being at odds with this. And what I'm going to talk about is a joint effort that I led, where we, Pioneer, the Corteva, we collaborated with multiple 13 universities across the U.S. and then up into actually the University of Guelph there in Ontario. If you see all these dots of all the locations we had, here we're getting into that Ontario area there, as well as, some stuff here on the south side of the lake. And so I just call that out as, a really good example of industry and academic collaboration and really getting us aligned, I think, for the first time on the messaging. And here's a great case, right? Corn VRS has been around for a while, but soybean VRS has been a little bit lacking. And so really just a huge study, across a pretty big swath here that we conducted, and, some key findings from that. And again, this is a free way to increase ROI across your acres, this year is, soybean VRS, that response really being the inverse of corn. So in corn, right, higher productivity increases seeding rate, lower productivity decreases seeding rate, where soybeans are just the exact opposite, right? Increases seeding rate in low yielding areas and decreases seeding rate in high yielding areas, relative to that field average. And I'd say what we also found from a risk perspective, with a lot of popular press pushing soybean seeding rates lower and low and low and low, and how low can you go? And I think that catches a lot of attention. And I think the difficulty in a lot of that data, right, is it's all small plot or under ideal field conditions where it's just flat and black and there's no variability, and you don't have a draw coming through the field or a knoll or a hilltop. And so it really doesn't do a good job of quantifying risk. And what we determined from this is that dropping seeding rates too far, down in high yield environments is the most risky. So working with Scott, working with Chris, where is that grower standard at your field? It's probably in that, 150-ish area. I'll shoot from the hip there. Scott and Chris can probably talk a little bit better, but, at 150, 160 area, and then use that as your baseline. And from there, move in higher areas of productivity, come down, and in lower areas of productivity, move up. And so what we do and what we found, after testing this model, across a lot of acres, a really high percentage of acres.
Before you go on,
yep.
Can you just define what AOSR stands for? Is that
yes, agronomically optimal seeding rate.
Gotcha.
So, yep. So I try not to get too deep into this, but basically, this agronomically optimal seeding rate, right? If you increase 20% above the agronomically optimal seeding rate, you have, a 59, 60, 56% chance. Whoops. Hold on, guys. I apologize. You have just a little bit over a 50% chance of increasing yield if you go 20% above the agronomically optimal seeding rate. And so not a lot of value there. There's some yield to be had, but it doesn't happen very often. But boy, if you go 20% below the agronomically optimal seeding rate in a high yield environment, you only have a 16% chance of increasing or maintaining that same yield, 17% in average yield environments, and a 35% chance in these low yield environments. And so again, just it
stresses the importance of keeping your seeding rate higher in those lower yield environments.
You got it. It's just the risk becomes, you can sneak away and be that, 17% of the time where you don't see a yield reduction. But again, at least driving through Ontario and the fields I saw in most of the fields, that yield monitor is not perfectly green all the way across the field, and there's variability that exists there. And so if you see, here's just a nice graphical representation of the model. And what you'll see is that, this blue line here, call this the local standard, right? 150,000 I'll use for example. When you move into lower areas of productivity, oops, let me get rid of that. You move into these lower areas of productivity here, right? We have almost an exponentially greater increase in seeding rate needed as you move into lower productivity areas than you do when you move in, than the decrease when you move into higher productivity areas. And I hope everybody can see kind of the slopes of those lines. It's not just this nice straight line that goes all the way across. It's there, and then boom, we see a big increase when we move into areas of lower productivity. And that was a very key finding that we saw. So in corn, right, it's pretty linear. Increase it as you go into good areas, decrease as you go into bad areas. Soybeans.
What do you think drives that? What's the predominant driver for those lower yield environments? Is it fertility, water holding capacity? What's your take?
Yeah, I think this all goes back to sunlight and capture, and typically in those lower productivity areas, you know, they're inherently maybe waterlogged, they're drier, hard to build fertility on. Water holding capacity is lower. Probably the biggest one, water holding capacity or saturation, are the bigger ones with soybeans. And so when we get into those, we reduce the crop growth rate pretty significantly, and we found that. Reducing that crop growth rate. And so when you reduce that crop growth rate in this area, really your only option is to increase seed number, which seed number is directly related to yield. It's a linear line, more seeds, more yield. And so when we get in these areas and reduce the crop growth rate, what happens is we don't produce enough nodes, pods, and seeds. And so the only way to make that up is to just put more plants out there to capture more light, turn that into more nodes, more pods, more seeds on a per unit area basis. Inversely, when we're into these higher yielding environments, right, we are maximizing the crop growth rate. It is running 100%. And so we have actually cushion. The thing limiting the crop growth rate on a per plant basis is not sunlight, it's plant to plant competition. And so that's why we can move the seeding rate down a little bit in these higher productivity areas, but again, not as much as the increase in low productivity areas. So crop growth rate here is limited by plant to plant competition. Plant growth rate here is limited by environmental factors such as water holding capacity. And so we're trying to maximize the plant growth rate for each plant. In these environments, it means you need more seed. In these environments, you need to just reduce seed, you know, the number of plants a little bit. Does that make sense, Scott?
I think you nailed it right on. That's a great explanation. And I think, so if somebody doesn't have the ability to run a variable rate script, they have a planner that's just equipped to go baseline, what would be your recommendation?
Yes. So I think it comes back to this one, Scott, you know, when, I apologize, let's go previous. It comes back to this graph right here. And where is your level of risk, right? If you got to flat rate it, you want to be risky and you want to be on this side, you know, 16%, 17%, 35% of maintaining or increasing yield versus the average? Or do you want to feel more comfortable in this area, right? 60%, 59%, 56%. From a risk perspective, you can really fall off the cliff very fast. And so from a yield, that's a reason why we see, you know, I'll just maybe draw it here if everybody can see, you know, here's yield and here's seeding rate. And what happens is you know, you get this line up here and then it tables off. The problem is that up here, if I change my color, the risk surrounding the response up here is really small. You know, it's probably a range like this, right? But as you move further down this graph here, the amount of error becomes much, much larger. And so this is risk. These red lines are basically risk. And so do you want to be up here with minimal risk, maintaining yield? Or do you want to take the chance where, yeah, on average, you're right here. You can get up here sometimes, you know, 16% of the time, 17% of the time you can hit this, but 80% of the time, guess where you're at? You're right there. And so I encourage growers, especially with, you know, a single rate with their planters. This is not the year to risk it and try and, you know, outsmart the environment and the biological system. You know, this is where it needs to be at right here from a risk perspective, 100%.
And I'd say too, as we get out on this end here, of the spectrum.
Oh shoot!
Yeah, no, it's fine. But as the seeding rate drops, it becomes, with early planting, more pathogens and colder soils and that sort of thing, it becomes more and more important to hit your seeding rate targets, right? The precision becomes that more important. I would agree. Cool.
Becomes very important. And, I think the one, if you just go back out of physiology and the agronomics, right? It's not as prevalent with you guys, as it is in South, Arkansas, but, weed control, right? You get down here, that becomes a problem. Harvestability becomes a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of other, kind of legit.
Vulnerability to adverse weather too, right? Like, I think what's our biggest risk as farmers is a dry spell. So if you have a higher stand count, soybeans, they really don't compete much with one another for soil available water with their taproot system. So if you've got drought prone ground, erring on the side of caution, higher seeding rate to get more nodes is the right thing to do.
That's 100% the right thing to do, Scott. Yeah, it's kind of scary. Like, boy, I'm going to put more seed in this kind of knobby hill, drought-prone soil, but that's exactly what you need to do. So, if I keep moving on here, just an example here. And what I wanted to point out, at least with our proprietary model, is in what I try and convey to growers. Our model, every field's different, but I'll say in general, what tends to happen across these fields is you end up using the same number of bags, right? You end up with the same average seeding rate. We're just placing the seed more precisely, more in the low productivity areas, less in the higher productivity areas. So it's really not an increased investment in seed. It's just a more efficient utilization of that investment and a higher return of that investment, which, to Chris's point, is extremely critical in years like this. And it's critical every year, right? That's where we need to be thinking. So soybean planting, to kind of move on to that, I'd say another area that's, maybe taking a back seat is just seed placement in the furrow, and how good of a job do we do that? And I think for a long time it's been touted that, boy, they can compensate and they're very forgiving, and those are just excuses, I think, for lower yields, is all those amount to be. And so I talk a little bit here about, seeding depth and spacing, and really making a good furrow and getting the soybean crop up to a good uniform start. And so even emergence is critical. And I think that's been, maybe lost in years back. And it's really a product of a good furrow, uniform depth, using a seed treatment, quality seed, good handling of the seed, and appropriate down pressure. And I should probably add in here, planter speed as well. How much are the row units bouncing up and down? What's not as critical is horizontal spacing, or, are the seeds 2 inches apart, 1 inch apart, 3 inches apart? That's not as critical. And, honestly, what we found with corn too, while, we like that nice picket fence with corn, it's all about just not missing a plant. You don't want to miss a plant there. And so I always tell people with soybeans, your horizontal placement is your vertical placement is much more important than your horizontal placement of the seed. And, many times, I think Chris did a nice job explaining that, with his graphs earlier, is that, obviously as you go deeper in the soil, you get less fluctuation in temperatures. And those fluctuations are really what the problem is. That we can get some really nasty things happening when we're, really ramping up and really ramping down. And that's really bad at any point during the growing season, from germination, emergence, early season growth, reproductive growth. I always like to use the analogy of an engine, right? It's really hard on engines when you just, throttle way up, run it hard, shut it off right away, then fire it up and run it really hard, shut it off. It's kind of the same concept with a plant. And so uniformity is really important. And I think many times we get caught planting soybeans too shallow. And and we sacrifice uniform emergence because of that shallow planting depth due to moisture line, fluctuations in temperature, etc. And so I really kind of give a graphical representation of a study, where early season, vegetative and harvest. And I think what I like to depict here is, at emergence, different levels of emergence, right? Here we go, we're just emerging to a plant here, a V1 plant here, VC here, and how that translates to images of plants throughout the growing season. And I would encourage everybody this year, a fun experiment that you could do is go out in a field and put a flag by these plants right here, these late emergers, and then just watch it through the growing season and then see what it looks like at the end of the year. I've done a lot of work in this area. And what we find is that these late emergers, like corn, they really contribute almost nothing to final yield. It's very little. And so it's actually pretty remarkable if you get them here, and this in-season attrition goes way up when you don't get uniform emergence. So we invest in this really good, high-quality seed, but if we don't get emergence correct and uniform emergence, what ends up happening is these late emergers die off with in-season attrition, or they end up looking like this plant here. And another cool one I'd encourage everybody to do is go out this year, pick an area, record your seeding rate, record your emergence, and then record final stand at harvest. And I think everybody will be very surprised at how many plants disappear in season. And you wonder, where the heck where did these things go? It's like they just disappeared. And it's really from these late emergers. And so this in-season plant attrition, it always happens. In-season plant attrition goes up with seeding rate up. And so the quick math I'll give you is, just think of 140,000 seeding rate. Any bag you buy is going to have a 90% germ. So you lose 10%, you're down to 126. And then a very typical, final, stand at maybe V3 is another 5 to 10% off of there. So you're already looking, you're down at 110. Then you have in-season plant attrition, and boom, you're hoping to stay above 100,000 plants per acre. And so, again, just going to that point of, a lot of risk associated with moving these plants, moving seeding rates lower. And if we're going to move seeding rates a little bit lower in these really high yielding environments, which we're recommending, you really have to nail uniform emergence in those areas. And I'll just give a good example.
Quick comment. Yep. We had a question come in. So do the plants surrounding the late emergers yield more than they would otherwise if it had been in even emerging stand? So say everything came up even, have you found in your plant counts, would they far outstrip the yield of the late emerging stand? Or is there still that attrition that you were mentioning?
Yeah.
I think is the case.
So, yep. Maybe I'll walk through this and see if this answers it, and then come back to it. So I'll just, there's a bunch of, I'll just go. So on the x-axis, right, I call it, initial seeding rate, replant seeding rate. And what this really represented was basically how many were there initially, 0, 0, 0, 40, 40, 60, 60, 80, 80, and 140,000 per acre. And then we went back in and reseeded this amount, 140, 180, 220, 0, 100, 0, 80. And so what we were able to derive here, and one that I would really draw your focus on is right here. So as we 40 initially, and all of this, ends up with 140,000 at the end of the day. That's where we are shooting for. But, 40,000 here plus 100,000 late emergers. Well, yeah, 61 to 67. We got a 6 bushel contribution from these 100,000 plants, right? Only gave us 6 bushels. 61 of the bushels came from the 40,000. Here's just another example. 60 and then replant with 80. Those 80 late emergers look how much they're contributing to yield, almost nothing. And then the same one here, 80 and then 60 late, we're getting a contribution of basically 1 to 2 bushels here. Where if we would have just had a nice uniform 140,000 at the beginning, look where our yield is at, right? Significantly higher than any of these more variable stands. And I think what this, really illustrates is that, those late emergers, right, they're contributing very little to yield. And to the question of, does that initial 60 then yield more? No, it doesn't. I have the wrong graph here, but we actually partitioned out the yield here, and it's really shocking how, maybe I'll just draw it in here, like in these green graphs, right? So if I had this bar and we divided out what percent of the yield came from the 60,000 and what percent came from the 80,000, that line ends up being just about right here. So what that would tell us, where, this is 60,000 and, this is the 80,000. And so what it tells us is, and it wasn't statistically significant, but it tells us that then those 60,000, they really don't do any better, without the competition or with the competition. And think of it like a weed. And really that's what this 80,000 becomes from, right? It's there taking nutrients, it's capturing sunlight, it's taking water, and it's not giving us any yield.
You can't forget about the shade avoidance response. Just their presence there triggers those early emerging weeds that go into shade avoidance response and partition more to above ground growth and less to their root. I did my master's research on that.
I like the comment, Scott. So I guess, the summary here, right, is how can we get even emergence right now, something that is free, that we got to do right at planting, and we really can't fix it late season. So whether that means parking the drill, slowing the planter down a second, those are all things we got to get a good standing merge, getting row cleaners, doing a good job making a furrow, all just very, very critical components that are to some extent free. I'll hit the fungicide real quick. Another input that is getting a lot of scrutiny this year. All I would say is just make sure, don't go any earlier than R3 unless you're, going after that white mold acre, right? And then obviously we're in an R1 followed by an R3 application. But if it's solely, a one-shot deal, which, I know white mold's a very heavy problem for most of the growers up there.
Just let's say that. Yeah.
Yep. So with that second shot, I guess I would encourage, white mold number 1, plant health number 2. But if you're in the case, later the better. We get a much stronger fungicide response with soybeans in the north than we do versus the south, even in the absence of disease or if white mold is there. And I'll just say one of the key things of why that happens is, not only prolonging plant health maximizes more sunlight capture. We already know how important sunlight is. And I just show that graphically here with this blue box, right? This is leaf area on each of these suckers. And what you find is that we maintain leaves longer in this high yielding environment with fungicide, and therefore we maintain plant health much longer into the growing season than we do at a lower yielding environment. The next one with foliar fungicide is, this is nitrogen in the plant. So where's all the N at in the plant in the different parts? And I'll just say really quickly, this blue blob right here, this is the leaf right here. And amount of nitrogen in the leaf represents 23% of the nitrogen that ends up in the seed. And so maintaining leaves on the plant, if a leaf senesces and dies early, it's basically wasted energy, right? The plant had to spend energy to fix end, to move it through the plant, get it into the leaf. And then at the end of the day, it wants to, move it and bring it into the seed. But if it drops early, it's basically wasted end, wasted energy, et cetera. And so maintaining leaves on the plant for as long as possible, whether, that's defending it against white mold or just natural, senescence, those are big things. So capturing light, preserving end are those big benefits there. Rotation effect really quick, and I know I'm going fast, folks. I'm watching the clock a little bit. I think, in Ontario, much more than other places, right? Having wheat in the rotation is just an awesome system. A lot of benefits to it. But in instances where we're either corn and corn or soybean and soybean, we always talk about that rotation effect. And before I joined Pioneer, we were doing some work on this, trying to quantify it because nobody had been able to before. And really what we found is there's a lot of soil microbiome, right? All the biological fungi, bacteria in the soil and the diversity of it. And what we found is that there's a pretty distinct difference between soybeans in green and corn in the kind of brown oranges. And basically just look at this graph as the further they are apart, the more different they are. And so even soybean following soybean, look how different it is than first year soybeans, but very similar to 5 years of soybeans, but very different from corn on corn. And so I just bring this up to have people think about that rotation effect. I think this is an avenue or a place where there's not only showing value in having wheat in the rotation, or if you have some prevent plant acres, or you get a crop out early, or you have a chance to get a cover crop in that doesn't, isn't too aggressive. There's some positive effects to the soil microbiome that can help you get over a continuous corn or a continuous soybean yield penalty. And basically that's what we're showing here, is just the further away you get from a soybean rotation, the higher your yield gets. And it's a pretty variable response, but still yet a response. And I think, this is an area of a lot of growth, a lot of research, a lot of questions. And, how do we make the soil more diverse? I think we're starting to understand that more diversity in the soil can translate into greater yield. But what's the most economical way to get more diversity in the soil? And how can we most effectively affect that soil, microbial diversity? Is that through different products? Is it through cropping systems, tillage, et cetera, et cetera? So just something to think about, kind of my one-off thing, I guess I'd give everybody to maybe let you think about as you're sitting in the tractor a little bit. I know I hit on this hard last week with fertility and just the importance of potassium and how critical it is every year, and especially in years of a drought. And the one that I'll just, kind of bring up, this spring, I think, if we've got fields that are looking like this picture where, we've got such big heads now on these combines and we're trying to battle the wind and blow stover over the whole pass. This is basically like, I think we get really upset when we have the floater out there spreading fertilizer and it's windy or they do a bad job. But then we take our combines out here and we don't care how the wind's blowing and if we're spreading well or not. We basically end up with these strips and more or less what your combine is, it's a potassium spreading machine. And just as we're out here this summer or this spring planting or doing spring tillage or no tilling some corn into these situations, I would just encourage you to see, do your fields look like this, and how can you fix this so that your fields don't look like this? If at the end of the day, logistically, right, you need big equipment, you need big heads, you got to cover acres. We can't stop combining because of the wind. I get all that. Just trying to be diligent about what direction you're combining to limit the effect of the wind. And then from year to year, how can you switch up your harvest passes so that, maybe this year it's this way. Can you go at an angle one year, a different angle the next year, just doing our best as we can, especially with the soybean stover and spreading out the back of the combine, because it is in such high content of potassium. And, you know, we can do all this work with variable rate fertilizer and grid sampling, and then we just throw it all out the window when we spread our stover like this.
We know what it's all about, trying to plant a 120 bushel wheat crop into a seed bed like that when you got soybeans that are yielding over 60 bushels.
It's tough. It's tough. So I'll give you some take-home messages, right? You know, I said, you know, this is a decade of soybeans. Keep that rolling into the 20, you know, this next decade. 2 questions you should be asking on your farm before you implement changes in management. And, you know, how can we increase the amount of sunlight we capture, and how can I extend reproductive duration? I'll say soybeans should be planted before corn, you know, both agronomically and economically. They should be. And I know that's a hard one to swallow, but the data's there. It proves it. The benefits are there. And I really challenge everybody, you know, to really take a hard look at that at your farm of what's going in the ground first. Especially as you move further north, the planting date response with soybeans just gets so distinct and really tails off fast. You know, management practice providing long-term and more resilient gains. High yields are a product of the system, not any particular year practice. Just remember that. You know, micros, biostimulants, they have a place, but they aren't the secret ingredient. And soybean planting accuracy is important. And you know, I know I'm talking to, you know, a group that certainly still plants wheat, but a drill should not be planting soybeans, or at least most of the drills that I see.
Jeff, you wait. I'm going to one.
Oh no, I would. For the most part, I think that comment is more right on than not.
I would agree. You're accurate in that, but we'll qualify that a little bit further.
Yeah, there's some folks that feel pretty strongly about their drills. I'd challenge them on it, and you know, and then I'd say, you know, if you got the drill, you want to put some money into the drill. Make sure it's doing a good job, slowing down, managing residue, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure the drill's doing a good job if you have it. Little optimism for all of you. You know, there's a lot of optimism in the north. A lot of yield gains are coming from, you know, a longer growing season, higher temps, and that's good for us in the north. A little bit higher CO2, that's good for a C3 crop like soybeans. We're going to continue to see, especially the group here, a very steady, positive effect of the environment with soybean yields. And at the end of the day, right, that's good. You know, the environment's good for us. We can't affect it. You know, 50% is the genetics and making sure we're selecting high yielding genetics. And then the other 50% of yield gain is coming from our management. And how do we optimize that management? So I'll leave it there. Right?
Thanks. I noticed it's just 3 minutes after 11. Thanks for all that information. Really good. We'll have a recording of this, and I'll send it out to the group afterwards. But we had some really good topics. I have lots of questions for you, but I think we'll open it up to questions for the group here first, and see if there's anything else. I did have a poll question on team planner, team drill, but I think that might get us into another hour-long discussion. So.
Oh man, a lot of I know that's
a big topic. But is there any questions from the group, guys? Okay, just let me know, Scott, if you can send us home, that'd be great, and then we'll
sure
we'll get to planning.
And I want to thank Adam for spending the time with us this morning. Yeah. Lots of great insights there. It's always great to hear a lot of these practices, these ideals from a different perspective, and it's very refreshing. But I just want to bring us home. I think a lot of the content that I had for my portion of the presentation was already covered by Adam, and following in his lead. I don't know that there's much that I can add, but I do kind of want to wade into that drill comment that you had, planters versus drill. So again, there are a lot of things that we can do on our farm that doesn't cost us a dime. So planting date, that was well covered off, the importance of getting beans planted early, seed bed prep, the analysis of what sort of furrow we're making, the soil conditions, getting out there and assessing the situation. I would argue the vast majority of producers that are batting above the average that I come in contact with, they sweat the details. They pay close attention to the job that they're doing. Seeding rate, we discussed that a fair bit. Planting depth, I'll touch on that, and planter setup. So I just wanted to kind of highlight quickly some of the work that we've done here locally within Ontario, which has kind of supported that response that we've seen to earlier planted fuller season beans. We had some research done in 2012 and 2013, and then again repeated some of that in 2015. It's great to hear that Chris is carrying that torch forward and going to try again here in 2020. And I would challenge you, Chris, target that May long weekend. It always seemed like when I was growing up as a kid, we transitioned from corn into soybeans around that May long weekend. And in an average year, I'd be really interested to see what sort of yield drop you see with those later planted years.
It was with a drill though, so.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Anyway.
So great discussion on seeding rate by environment. And I think that's the big point that we want to stress. So like areas or environments where we want to increase our seeding rate, it's those lower yield environments where we aren't going to get quite as much top growth, canopy growth, and sunlight capture. And then there's some other factors that we really want to pay close attention to. Any situation with heavy residue and no-till environment, unfavorable soil conditions, we want to increase that seeding rate as well. Aged equipment, that's a big one. If we're not doing a detailed job with the equipment that we're using, we've seen that graph where if we err on the side of caution and put down more seed, that's gonna cover our risk of not achieving a high yield crop. And then Adam stressed this point, the impact that relative maturity has, and I would argue in the north, we want to capture as much sunlight as possible, get that crop to canopy as soon as possible. If we're growing a maturity group that's less than a 1.0, we want to increase our seeding rates to help compensate and get that crop canopied as quickly as possible before things flower, because we don't have the length of time, that flowering window after canopy closure, after that summer solstice, in order to achieve top end yields. I think this slide really does highlight what I've observed out in the countryside. So these pictures were taken back in 2018. So it was a high yielding soybean year. And the situation was we had a sales rep that had a PKP unit of 09A53s. They're a big seeded bean. And he had a bunch of seed that of his own supply that was smaller seeded, whereas the PKP bags were quite a bit bigger. And he planted this field with his regular seed, and his drop rate was around 150,000 seeds per acre. But when he got into that big seeded soybean, his planter wasn't able to hit his target rate, and he only dropped about 50 to 60 was the final plant stand in this lower population area. You can just see how much the bean crop compensated in this high yield environment. Albeit it was uniformly thin, all right? It was planted with a 15-inch row planter, and the ground was worked. This is a high yield environment where corn would run north of 210 bushels per acre, but you can see the impact that lower seeding rate has on the crop physiology. So I think that's a key point that we really want you to take home with from today. And then I guess we'll kind of just wrap things up with this slide. I'll wade into the drill versus planter debate. And I guess I would ask, can a drill plant beans as well as a planter? And I would argue that it can, but it just takes more attention to detail, making sure that we're operating that drill at the proper speed, that we have the right downforce to ensure that we are getting our soybeans planted to the proper depth. And I would like to target sort of an inch planting depth. Make sure that as we're starting out that we're getting our soybeans planted into moisture. As the season goes on and soil conditions dry out, we're going to want to chase that moisture and get our drills or our planters planting our beans into proper moisture so that they can imbibe that water and start that germination process. And it really does take that level of attention to detail where we're looking at row by row settings. With these John Deere box drills, the key thing to remember is you need to set the right amount of downforce to ensure that we're getting that seed furrow placed at the proper depth. And that really does come down to proper ballasting on the back there. You basically want to compress those springs to ensure that we're getting the weight transferred from that box onto all those row units rather than the tires along the back. So as soil conditions dry out, if you're planting into heavy clays, you're going to have to pay close attention to that, because the odds are if you crank up this dial and add a lot more pressure to those springs, we're going to lift up those back gauge wheels. And especially if we're traveling along at any decent speed, that's where we really struggle to ensure that we're getting our beans planted in proper moisture. So pay close attention to that if you're on some heavier ground planting in no-till environments. Residue level will definitely impact how well these box drills and regular seed cart drills operate, as well as how sharp your seed discs are. So hopefully that kind of helps shed some light as to where these drills, they certainly have a fit, especially if we're planting wheat. We've got the equipment on the farm, and we want to kill two birds with one stone, get the corn planted with your regular planter and get some beans planted as well as early as possible. Last thing I'll kind of leave you with is in-season management. Adam kind of touched on the use of fungicides for plant health. I just kind of draw your attention to granular insights. So it is a field scouting tool. And obviously when we see this situation out in the field, the horse is out of the corral, the damage has already been done. But I would challenge you that these photos were taken, I believe it was in 2017, in August. You can see the high health areas, the low health areas where the white mold set in. If we went back in time and looked at the satellite image from July the 18th, we'll look at where that high health area was setting up. That's where that's the environment where we would anticipate that white mold will infect. Lo and behold, it did. And that's the time of year, late July, early August, that we want to be making that fungicide call. Great opportunity to be out scouting and having a look at your crop and weighing the benefit of a fungicide at that time of season. It's those cool nighttime temperatures in August where we have heavy dews, that canopy is very lush and growthy. That's where white mold tends to sit in and infect our crop late in season. So with that, I'll kind of pass it back to you, Chris, if we have any other questions.
Maybe Scott, I'll tag on to your white mold comment there, and you know, the variable rate seeding is I think another great tool here. That, you know, typically our white mold hotspots are those really high productive areas, right? Get a lot of luscious growth, and you know, obviously one good management practice is in those really big hotspots, you know, getting seeding rate right.
What's your take on row width with hot white mold environments? Because that's the question we often get asked, and I feel like the bigger impact that we have here in the north is canopy closure at a summer solstice, right? So I would rather see that we narrow up those row widths. But there's a lot of guys there seeing the the wider rows.
If I could find the picture, I've got a lot of great pictures kind of showing like, row width or seeding rate or, even planting date, like that interaction on white mold detection. And what we find over and over again is certainly seeding rate is the bigger factor. Row width is not as consistent, nearly as consistent. And just think of it from like, as you go into wider rows, plants get closer together in that row, obviously. And so that's why we very often see seeding rate's a bigger player. Row spacing, we detect an effect sometimes not. It's just not as consistent. So what I would encourage folks, if they're with a drill or I like 15-inch row spacing in the north, for you guys, I would stick with that.
Yeah.
And put your money into, VRS capabilities for your planter and spraying a fungicide. I think those are much better places to invest for white mold management than just planting in 30-inch rows. Because in that case, you're dropping yield, you're struggling with weed control, you're not closing canopy like you said, and you're really not having a consistent effect on white mold control. So.
Right on. Okay, guys. Well, I think that pretty much sums up the time we had allotted. We're about 15 minutes past, and I know a lot of you guys are maybe itching to plant some beans now, but we'll just we'll leave it at that. And thanks everyone for coming online here. I'll be sending out a copy of this so you can explore it a little bit further. But I really think we covered some good ground today. Want to thank Adam for joining us, and thank Scott for taking the lead on the Ontario perspective. So with that, safe planting, guys. Whether you're in the bunker or you're in the field there, just keep safe during this time, eh? Take care.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem. Hey, Adam, you got a sec to just stay on after I want to ask you a question. Yeah. You there? Oh, be able to. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute, guys.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No.
I was
saying per acre protein has gone up